Okay, let's dive right into one of the absolute foundational texts of political philosophy. We're talking about Thomas Hobbes' masterwork, Leviathan, written way back in 1651, right in the middle of the bloody chaos of the English Civil War. This book literally changed how we think about government. And honestly, its ideas, they still dictate the world you live in right now. Why? Because Hobbes did something totally radical for his time. He didn't start with kings or some kind of divine right or even lofty morals. No, he completely dismantled human nature, taking it apart like a clock, to figure out the actual origins of society. So we're going to look at exactly how he built his argument gear by gear.
Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The clockwork human. 2. Words, reason, and science. 3. The passions that drive us. 4. The natural state of war. 5. Laws of nature and covenants. And finally, 6. Building the artificial man.
Section 1. The clockwork human, understanding the mechanics of the mind.
To understand this state, Hobbes tells us we have to start by looking inward. He actually revives this ancient Latin phrase, noce tipsum, which translates to read thyself. See, Hobbes argues that you really don't need to read 1,000 history books to understand human nature. You literally just need to honestly observe your own inner workings. His point is, if you understand what makes you hope, or fear, or reason, well, you basically hold the blueprint for all of humanity.
And this brilliantly illustrates his core premise. Everything, and I mean everything, begins with physical motion. Hobbes was completely fascinated by geometry and physics. He proposes that what we call our senses are really just our biological bodies reacting to external objects pushing against them. A sound, that's just motion hitting your ear. A color, just motion hitting your eye. At our core, we're just these physical engines reacting to a physical world. So from that initial physical sensory impact, we get this mechanical chain reaction. Hobbes explains that imagination is actually just a decaying sense. Think of it kind of like the ripples in a pond that stick around long after the wind has stopped blowing. The image in your mind is just the lingering momentum of that initial physical strike on your senses. And when we collect a huge archive of these fading, decaying senses over a long period of time, what we call that memory. And a massive collection of memories is exactly what we call experience. Section 2. Words, reason, and science. Computing our reality. So how do those inner mechanics actually connect to language and, separate us from the beasts? Well, Hobbes points out that without speech, our thoughts just wander completely aimlessly. It's this unguided mental discourse, honestly very much like a dream. But the invention of words, that changes absolutely everything. Words basically allow us to plant flags in the ground. We use them as marks to register our thoughts, remember them, and declare them to others so we can work together. Because without language, there is literally no society, no social contract, and definitely no peace. And here is a real game changer. Hobbes totally strips away all the mysticism surrounding human intelligence. He views reasoning not as some kind of magical spiritual insight, but as literal mental math. It's just computation. To reason is, very simply, to add and subtract the consequences of defined words. When we get our definitions wrong, our math is wrong, and we end up with absolute absurdities. But when our definitions are precise, that reckoning leads us directly to science. Section 3. The passions that drive us. The engines of human behavior. Now this introduces the actual fuel for our biological machines. If our senses are incoming motions, our passions are the outgoing motions. And Hobbes introduces a radically subjective idea here. He argues that good and evil, they don't objectively exist out there in the universe. There is no universal moral truth just floating in the sky. Good is simply the label you put on things that you have an appetite for, things you naturally want to move toward. Evil is just your label for things you have an aversion to, things you want to run away from. It's entirely biological and entirely subjective. All of our complex human emotions are just combinations of these basic moving parts. Hope is literally just an appetite combined with the belief that you can actually get what you want. Fear is an aversion plus the belief that it's going to hurt you. And when your mind is bouncing back and forth between appetites and aversions, like wanting to do something but being afraid to do it, Hobbes calls that deliberation. And what about your will? Well, it's nothing mystical at all. Your will is simply the very last appetite or aversion you feel right before you take action. You are essentially a calculating machine of desires. Section 4. The natural state of war. When machines collide. So, what exactly happens when you put a bunch of these subjective, self-interested, calculating machines together without any rules? Well, Hobbes notes that human beings are roughly equal in their physical and mental capacities. I mean, at least equal enough that any one person could potentially kill another. And because we're equal, we all have the same hope of achieving our goals. This naturally leads to three main triggers for violence. First, there's competition, as we inevitably fight over scarce resources. Second is diffidence, which is this deep mutual distrust. Basically, you strike first because you know they might strike you. And third, glory, which is the fight for reputation and respect. Without a central authority to keep all these human machines in check, Hobbes famously paints this state of nature as a terrifying perpetual war. It is quite literally everyone against everyone. In this state, there is no law, there is no property, and therefore nothing is actually unjust. You have a natural right to absolutely anything you can get your hands on, up to and including another person's body if you think it's going to help you survive. It is a state of constant, paralyzing fear.
Section 5. Laws of Nature and Covenants. Escaping the chaos. Fortunately for us, our passions and our reason provide an escape hatch. Our absolute terror of violent death makes us deeply, deeply desire peace. Then our reason steps in and basically does the math. Reason formulates the first law of nature. You must seek peace if you want to survive. And to actually get that peace, reason dictates the second law. You have to be willing to lay down your absolute natural right to do whatever you want, as long as others are willing to do the same. You are essentially trading your total, dangerous freedom for mutual security. We secure this peace through agreements, which Hobbes calls covenants. Now remember, back in the state of nature, nothing was unjust. Hobbes argues that justice is an entirely artificial construct. It only comes into existence after these covenants are made. Injustice is simply breaking the contract you already agreed to. Section 6. Building the artificial man, the Leviathan. But wait, there is a massive, glaring problem with human agreements. We know from our own mechanical breakdown that human passions are inherently selfish. We're driven by appetite and glory, right? So if it benefits us to break the rules and we think we can get away with it, our biological machinery will push us to do exactly that. So the big question is, how do we make the covenant actually stick? And this brings us to Hobbes' ultimate chilling conclusion. Words are incredibly weak against our greed and ambition. As he says, covenants without the sword are but words. The only thing that can override our selfish passions and keep us to our word is a passion that is even stronger, the terrifying, overwhelming fear of a coercive power. So how does all this build into the society you and I live in today? Well, to escape the chaotic state of nature, we make mutual covenants. But to actually enforce those covenants, we must all simultaneously transfer our individual power and rights to a single central sovereign. By doing this, we create a commonwealth. We give a supreme authority and absolute monopoly on violence, purely so it can enforce the peace, through the constant threat of punishment. Through this social contract, we have essentially built a massive artificial giant, the Leviathan. We have pooled all our individual rights, our individual strengths, and our individual wills to create an artificial soul and an artificial body. The sovereign is the head, the magistrates are the joints, the laws are the nerves. We literally built a monster to save ourselves from our own destructive mechanical nature. It's a really dark, mechanical, yet incredibly powerful view of human civilization. Hobbes doesn't appeal to our better angels. He appeals to our fear and our inner calculators. And honestly, it leaves you wondering as you look around at the world today. Are all our modern institutions, our laws, our governments, really just the necessary springs and wheels keeping the beast of human nature safely contained? What actually happens to the machine when the fear of the sword begins to fade? It's a pretty terrifying thought to leave you with. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the machinery of the world around you.